Into the darkness over Sicily. The night of July 9th, 1943, revealed the horrifying gap between airborne theory and airborne reality. Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily, would be the first large-scale combat jump for American paratroopers, and it would nearly end in catastrophe. The plan seemed elegant on paper. Drop thousands of paratroopers behind the beaches, seize key bridges and crossroads, create chaos in the German and Italian rear areas, prevent reinforcements from reaching the coast where the main invasion force would land at dawn. But paper plans dissolve the moment they encounter wind, darkness, inexperienced pilots, and enemy fire. Gavin boarded his C-47 transport aircraft knowing the odds. Intelligence reports were incomplete. The pilots of the 52nd Troop Carrier Wing had minimal combat experience. The weather was deteriorating. High winds would scatter the formations, and perhaps most critically, the drop zones were deep in enemy territory. If the planes missed their marks, paratroopers would land scattered across miles of hostile terrain, isolated, outnumbered, forced to fight their way toward objectives they might never reach. Most generals would have monitored this operation from a command ship offshore, receiving radio reports, moving pins on maps, issuing orders to adjust the plan as information arrived. Gavin strapped on his parachute, checked his M1 Garand, and prepared to jump into the same chaos he was ordering his men to enter. The flight across the Mediterranean was turbulent. The C-47 formation struggled to maintain cohesion as they approached the Sicilian coast. Then the anti-aircraft fire began. Streams of tracer rounds cutting through the darkness, explosions buffeting the aircraft, pilots breaking formation to evade, compasses spinning, navigation collapsing. The carefully planned drop zones became theoretical concepts as planes scattered across the night sky, each pilot making desperate decisions about where and when to drop their human cargo. Gavin's aircraft took fire. The green light came on, the signal to jump, and he was the first man out the door, plunging into darkness over enemy territory with absolutely no certainty about where he would land or who would be there when he hit the ground. This is the moment that separates theoretical leadership from the kind that imprints itself on the souls of soldiers. The general jumped first, disappeared into the night, accepted the same terrifying unknown that every private was experiencing. He landed hard in an olive grove, alone. The characteristic sound of a combat jump gone wrong echoed across the Sicilian countryside. Isolated rifle shots, distant explosions, the confusion of scattered men trying to find each other in darkness, trying to determine which shadows were friend and which were enemy. Gavin's meticulous planning had prepared him for this. Every paratrooper carried a small metal cricket, a child's toy that made a distinct clicking sound, to identify themselves to each other. Click-clack, click-clack, the sound of Americans trying to find Americans in a landscape crawling with enemies. Gavin moved through the darkness, gathering soldiers, not just officers, not just his own regiment, any paratrooper he encountered. In the chaos of scattered drops, command structures dissolved. A general became simply another armed man trying to organize resistance, trying to accomplish the mission despite the complete breakdown of the plan. This was Gavin's natural element, tactical chaos requiring immediate decisions with incomplete information. By dawn, he had assembled a composite force of approximately 200 men from various units. They had landed miles from their intended drop zone. Communication with higher headquarters was impossible. The radios had been lost or damaged in the drop. The Germans were already reacting, moving troops to seal off the invasion beaches. Gavin made a decision that encapsulates his command philosophy. Attack. Don't wait for orders. Don't wait for the situation to clarify. Don't consolidate and defend. Attack. His scratch force moved aggressively toward their objectives, engaging German positions, creating exactly the kind of chaos and uncertainty that airborne operations were designed to produce. The Germans couldn't determine if they were facing 200 men or 2,000. Every engagement forced the enemy to divert troops from the beaches, to hesitate, to react rather than execute their own plans. Over the following days, as the Sicily campaign developed, the performance of American paratroopers became a subject of intense analysis. The drops had been a navigational disaster, men scattered across hundreds of square miles, units mixed together, objectives missed. By conventional military standards, the operation should have been classified as a failure. But the paratroopers had accomplished something more valuable than seizing specific bridges or crossroads. They had created systemic confusion throughout the German rear areas, forcing the enemy to fight in multiple directions, preventing the kind of coordinated counterattack that might have driven the invasion back into the sea. And Gavin had been there, not coordinating from safety, but fighting alongside privates and corporals, making tactical decisions in real time, proving that his stars meant he carried more responsibility, not less risk. The psychological impact on his troops was profound. Soldiers who might have felt abandoned by higher command instead felt connected to it. When a general shares the first terrifying step into darkness, when he lands in the same hostile territory, carries the same rifle, faces the same possibility of capture or death, he purchases something that cannot be obtained through speeches or decorations: absolute trust. But this trust came with a darker edge. Gavin's willingness to share risk also meant he expected absolute performance from his men. He was building not just a division, but a culture, one where excuses were unacceptable, where failure was met with instant relief from command, where the standard was not adequate, but exceptional. His presence in combat jumps was not merely inspirational, it was a form of psychological pressure. How could a soldier justify hesitation when his general had already jumped? How could an officer claim a mission was impossible when Gavin had already proven it could be done? This was leadership as shared ordeal, and it was forging the 82nd Airborne into something exceptional and something dangerous.
Normandy, the ultimate test of shared sacrifice. By June 1944, James Gavin had been promoted to Major General and given command of the entire 82nd Airborne Division. At 37, he was the youngest two-star general in the United States Army since the Civil War. His division was being prepared for the most ambitious military operation in human history, Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. The airborne component, Operation Neptune, would drop thousands of American and British paratroopers behind the Atlantic Wall in the hours before dawn on June 6th, tasked with seizing critical causeways, bridges, and towns to prevent German reinforcements from reaching the beaches where the main invasion force would land. The scale was staggering. The risks were existential. Unlike Sicily, where failure meant a setback, failure in Normandy could mean the collapse of the entire invasion, the deaths of tens of thousands of soldiers trapped on the beaches, and potentially the prolongation of the war by years. Every Allied planner understood that the airborne drops were a calculated gamble, dropping lightly armed infantry deep behind heavily fortified German positions, hoping they could survive long enough to accomplish their missions. Most senior commanders viewed the airborne plan with a mixture of hope and dread. Air Chief Marshal Sir Trafford Leigh-Mallory predicted casualties as high as 70% for the paratroopers, arguing that the drops would result in the futile slaughter of two fine divisions. The terrain of Normandy's Cotentin Peninsula was nightmarish for airborne operations. Fields deliberately flooded by the Germans to prevent glider landings, hedgerows that would break up unit cohesion, a dense network of German positions that could massacre isolated groups of paratroopers. Gavin received the same intelligence briefings as every other commander. He knew the German 91st Air Landing Division was positioned exactly where his men would be dropping. He knew about the flooded fields that could drown paratroopers weighed down by equipment. He knew that the pre-dawn darkness would scatter his formations, that the Bocage countryside would fragment his units, that communication would be nearly impossible in the first critical hours. And he knew he would be jumping with them. This was no longer a matter of proving leadership or building morale. By 1944, Gavin had already established his reputation. His stars and his combat record gave him every justification to command from England, monitoring the operation through radio reports, ready to commit reserves or adjust plans as the situation developed. No one would have questioned this decision. No military doctrine required a division commander to personally participate in a combat jump. In fact, most military thinking argued against it. If Gavin was killed or captured in the initial hours, the entire division would lose its commander at the moment of maximum chaos. But Gavin saw leadership differently. He had built the 82nd Airborne into an elite force through shared hardship, and he understood that his presence in that first aircraft, his willingness to be among the first men to land in occupied France, was not optional. It was the foundation of everything he had built. To command from safety now would be to betray the contract he had made with his soldiers. That rank meant greater responsibility, not greater safety. The night of June 5, 1944, Gavin conducted his final briefing. His officers knew the plan: seize St. Mara-Éclise, secure the causeways behind Utah Beach, establish defensive positions to hold against inevitable German counterattacks. But plans were abstractions. What mattered was the moment when the green light came on and men had to step into darkness over a country armed and waiting to kill them. Gavin boarded his C-47. He carried his M1 Garand, the same rifle his privates carried. He carried ammunition, grenades, a map, a compass, standard infantry load. He wore the same parachute, faced the same anti-aircraft fire, experienced the same gut-churning terror as the aircraft approached the drop zone and the sky filled with tracer fire and exploding flak. Then the light turned green and Gavin jumped into history. The drop was chaos. German anti-aircraft fire was heavier than anticipated. Pilots took evasive action, scattering the formations. The pathfinders who were supposed to mark the drop zones had themselves been scattered. Gavin landed in darkness, not knowing precisely where he was, surrounded by the sounds of distant combat, small arms fire crackling across the Norman countryside, the crash of gliders breaking apart as they landed in the hedgerows. He moved through the darkness using the same cricket signal, the same whispered challenges and passwords, gathering soldiers. In the first hour, he assembled approximately 50 men from various units, a captain, several lieutenants, NCOs, privates, all jumbled together by the chaos of the drop. No radios, no contact with the bulk of the division, no clear picture of whether the drop had succeeded or failed catastrophically. And he made the same decision he had made in Sicily. Attack, move toward the objectives, create chaos for the Germans. Don't wait for clarity or reinforcement. The mission was not to survive, but to accomplish the task regardless of the cost. His composite force moved through the Bocage, engaging German patrols, seizing crossroads, establishing defensive positions to hold against inevitable German counterattacks. In those first desperate hours, before dawn broke over the invasion beaches, small groups of American paratroopers scattered across the Cotentin Peninsula accomplished something that defied conventional military logic. They created the impression of a massive airborne assault, forcing the Germans to react defensively, to fragment their own forces trying to contain what they believed were multiple battalion-strength attacks. By mid-morning on June 6th, as reports began filtering back to Allied headquarters, the picture became clearer. The airborne drops had been geographically scattered and tactically chaotic, but operationally successful. The Germans had been prevented from mounting coordinated counterattacks against the beaches. Critical causeways had been seized. Towns that controlled access to Utah Beach were in American hands. And throughout it all, paratroopers who had landed in the wrong locations, who had fought isolated actions with no support and no clear understanding of the larger battle, had one crucial fact. Their general had jumped with them. Gavin was somewhere in that same darkness, facing the same enemy, carrying the same rifle, fighting the same desperate battles. This knowledge transformed how soldiers fought. There were no excuses, no justifications for hesitation. If the general could land in darkness and attack with 50 men, then every paratrooper was expected to do the same. Gavin's presence in combat was not merely inspirational. It was a form of absolute accountability that ran both directions. He would not ask them to face risks he would not face, and they could not justify failure when he had already proven success was possible. But there was a cost to this approach, one that would become clearer as the Normandy campaign progressed.
The warrior who refused the general's chair. In the annals of military history, there exists a peculiar distinction between those who command from maps and those who command from mud. The gap between rank and reality, between the safety of headquarters and the violence of the front line, has always been a chasm that separates the ordinary officer from the legendary. Most generals of World War II understood warfare as an intellectual exercise, a chess game played with divisions and battalions, orchestrated from behind desks, communicated through radios, observed from a comfortable distance. They wore their stars with the understanding that those stars purchased them safety, privilege, and separation from the men they sent to die. But there was one man who saw those stars differently. One man who looked at his general's insignia and saw not a ticket to safety, but a heavier burden of shared sacrifice. His name was James Maurice Gavin, and he would become the only general officer in World War II to jump into combat with his paratroopers, carrying the same M1 Garand rifle they carried, facing the same bullets, the same chaos, the same terror. This was not theater. This was not a publicity stunt orchestrated for morale or propaganda. This was a fundamental rejection of the distance that rank typically creates, a psychological profile that reveals something darker and more complex than simple bravery. Gavin's decision to jump with his men, to be the first general to land in occupied territory during the largest airborne operations in history, speaks to a mindset forged not in the classrooms of West Point, but in the desperate mathematics of survival and the brutal psychology of leadership under fire. Born in 1907 in Brooklyn, New York, Gavin's early life was marked by the kind of hardship that either breaks a man or forges him into something harder than the circumstances that tried to crush him. Adopted as an infant, raised in a working-class family in Pennsylvania's coal country, young Gavin found himself surrounded by the grinding poverty of industrial America. There was no inheritance, no family connections, no path to power except through his own will. At 17, he lied about his age and enlisted in the United States Army, not out of patriotism, but out of necessity. The Army was an escape route from the mines, from the factories, from a future that promised nothing but exhaustion and early death. But the Army revealed something in Gavin that even he might not have recognized, a capacity for relentless self-improvement, an obsessive dedication to mastering the craft of war, and a leadership style that would eventually be described as both inspiring and punishing. He was not a natural soldier in the traditional sense. He was too intellectual, too questioning, too willing to challenge doctrine. But he possessed something more valuable than blind obedience. He possessed adaptability, the ability to see warfare not as a static set of rules, but as a constantly evolving problem that demanded creative, often brutal solutions. By 1941, as America stumbled toward war, Gavin had risen to captain and was teaching tactics at West Point. He was 34 years old, already marked by his superiors as an officer of exceptional potential. But potential meant nothing in the coming storm. What mattered was whether a man could function when the carefully constructed plans collapsed, when the maps proved wrong, when the enemy refused to cooperate with the simulation. The birth of American airborne forces gave Gavin his arena. Paratroopers, soldiers who would be dropped behind enemy lines, isolated, outnumbered, expected to cause chaos and hold critical positions until relieved, required a different kind of officer. They needed leaders who understood that airborne operations were inherently desperate gambles, that the moment a paratrooper left the aircraft, he was committed to a course of action that might end in capture, death, or worse. The psychological profile required was specific: controlled aggression, comfort with uncertainty, and an absolute refusal to abandon men in the field. Gavin volunteered immediately. He saw in airborne warfare what others saw as madness, opportunity, the chance to command elite troops, to operate with tactical independence, to prove that rapid deployment and aggressive action could achieve what traditional warfare could not. But more than that, Gavin understood something fundamental about soldiers. They will follow a man who shares their danger, but they will die for a man who shares their first step into that danger. By 1943, Gavin was a brigadier general commanding the 87th Airborne Division's 505 Parachute Infantry Regiment. At 36, he was one of the youngest generals in the American military. His rise had been meteoric, his reputation already legendary among paratroopers. But reputation means nothing when you order men to jump into darkness over hostile territory. Words mean nothing when you're asking soldiers to trust that the planes will drop them in the right location, that the equipment will function, that they won't land in the ocean or on German positions or alone in the French countryside with nothing but a rifle and a prayer. So Gavin made a decision that would define his command and his legacy. He would jump first. Not symbolically, not occasionally, always. Every combat jump his men made, he would make. Every risk they faced falling through the night sky, he would face. The M1 Garand rifle he carried was not for show. It was the same weapon his privates carried, the same weight, the same 8-round clip, the same potential for jamming or malfunction. This was leadership stripped to its most primal form. I will not ask you to go where I will not go first.
The price of leading from the front. The weeks following D-Day revealed the brutal mathematics of Gavin's leadership philosophy. The 82nd Airborne was not withdrawn after the initial objectives were secured. Instead, they were committed to the grinding fight through the bocage, vicious, close-quarters combat in the dense hedgerow country where every field was a potential killing zone, where German machine gun nests could massacre entire squads, where progress was measured in hundreds of yards purchased with dozens of lives. Gavin remained forward, constantly visiting his battalions, personally assessing positions, making tactical adjustments in real time. He did not command from a rear headquarters. He commanded from the front lines, and this created a paradox that would define both his legend and his burden. Soldiers fought harder because he was there, but they also died in greater numbers because he demanded a tempo of operations that never allowed the enemy to recover. The 82nd Airborne suffered catastrophic casualties in Normandy. Entire companies were reduced to platoon strength. Battalions that had jumped into France with 700 men finished the campaign with 200. The division's casualty rate approached 60%, nearly the apocalyptic prediction that Air Chief Marshal Lee Mallory had made, though for different reasons than he had anticipated. The Germans hadn't slaughtered them in the drop zones. They had ground them down in weeks of relentless combat, where Gavin's refusal to accept stalemate meant continuous operations regardless of losses. But those losses achieved something. The 82nd became known as one of the most effective divisions in the European theater. When Gavin's paratroopers attacked, they broke through. When they defended, they held. Their reputation preceded them, and German commanders learned to fear encountering the 82nd in combat. This effectiveness was purchased with blood, and Gavin understood the exchange he was making. He was trading the lives of his soldiers for operational success, and his willingness to share their danger was both the justification and the burden of that trade. In September 1944, the 82nd participated in Operation Market Garden, the disastrous Allied attempt to seize bridges across the Netherlands and punch into Germany before Christmas. Once again, Gavin jumped with his men, this time near Nijmegen, where his division was tasked with capturing the massive bridge across the Wal River. The operation was a strategic failure. British paratroopers were destroyed at Arnhem, the offensive stalled, and the war would continue for another 8 months. But Gavin's portion of the mission succeeded because he was there, personally coordinating the audacious river assault across the Wal in flimsy canvas boats under withering German fire. He stood on the riverbank as his paratroopers paddled across open water, German machine guns tearing into them, men falling into the river, boats sinking, survivors struggling to reach the far shore and assault fortified positions. A British officer who witnessed the assault called it the most gallant attack he had ever seen. Gavin could have ordered that attack from a command post. Instead, he was there, visible, exposed, sharing the horror of watching men die in an attack he had ordered. This was the dark core of his leadership. He would not ask them to do anything he would not witness, and his presence transformed what might have been a suicidal order into something soldiers would attempt because their general was there, watching, accountable. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1944, Gavin had jumped into 4 combat operations: Sicily, Salerno, Normandy, and Holland. He was the only Allied general officer to do so. His M1 Garand, the same rifle he had carried through every campaign, had become a symbol of his command philosophy. Leadership was not about privilege or safety, it was about shared sacrifice and visible accountability. But what does this really mean? Was Gavin a hero, or was he something more complicated? A commander whose personal courage enabled him to demand inhuman performance from his men, whose presence in combat jumps made it impossible for soldiers to refuse missions that might be tactically questionable? The paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne loved Gavin with an intensity that bordered on worship, but they also died in numbers that exceeded almost any other division in the European theater. After the war, Gavin continued to rise through the ranks, eventually becoming a lieutenant general and U.S. ambassador to France. He wrote extensively about airborne operations and leadership, but he rarely discussed the psychological toll of being the general who jumped. He had proven that rank did not have to mean distance from danger, that stars could be worn into combat, that generals could carry the same rifles as privates. But he had also proven something darker, that exceptional courage at the command level enables exceptional demands at every level, and that soldiers will follow a leader into hell if that leader is willing to make the journey with them. The 82nd Airborne's casualty lists were the price of that willingness. James Morris Gavin died in 1990 at the age of 82. His funeral was attended by hundreds of paratroopers, old men who had jumped with him into darkness over Sicily, Normandy, and Holland. They remembered the general who refused the safety that his rank offered, who carried an M1 Garand into combat, who was first out the door of every aircraft, who shared every danger he ordered them to face. They remembered, and they understood what most military historians missed. Gavin's decision to jump with his men was not merely symbolic, it was a fundamental rejection of the distance between command and consequence, between ordering death and witnessing death. He had built an elite division by making himself accountable in the most primal way possible, by standing in the same killing zones, falling through the same darkness, facing the same bullets. The 82nd Airborne's motto became all the way, and Gavin had embodied that ethos absolutely. He had gone all the way, every time, refusing the escape that his stars offered. In doing so, he had proven that generals could lead from the front, that courage existed at every level of command, that shared sacrifice was the foundation of elite military performance. But he had also proven that such leadership comes with a cost measured in blood, that exceptional units are forged through exceptional casualties, and that the paratroopers who loved him enough to follow him anywhere paid for that love with their lives, at a rate that makes his legacy both inspiring and haunting. The only World War II general to carry an M1 and jump with his men was not merely brave. He was the embodiment of a leadership philosophy that erased the line between commanded and commanded, between safety and sacrifice. And in erasing that line, he created something extraordinary and something terrible, a division that would accomplish any mission regardless of the cost, because their general had already proven he would pay that cost along them.